One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Let's talk just a little bit about leaky lung to round out this 2 or 3 episodes. We were talking about inflammation and the barrier systems. And just as a quick reminder, and if you haven't listened to the last 2, you might want to go back and catch those where we link inflammation to the impact of leaky gut as well as to leaky brain and some of the clinical ways that presents that you need to know about. So what about leaky lung? That's not really a term that you're going to find in the medical literature. In fact, you're probably not going to find the term leaky brain, although you'll see something like blood barrier, brain blood barrier permeability or something like that. But leaky lung is a concept that by extension is quite valid because just as the cytoarchitecture or the structure and the cells and the tissues that are involved in keeping the gut barrier intact and keeping the blood-brain barrier intact, just like those are identical, so is the lining of the respiratory system. And so if you think about what barrier systems do, they separate 2 different compartments or 2 different environments, but there are ways that things can get into our body, like a cut through the skin, we can swallow them, or we can breathe them in. And so the lining of the nasal passage, the sinuses, and the respiratory tree, the bronchus, all the way down to the alveoli, all need to have some way to filter things out so that things that we don't want to get into our bloodstream don't get into our bloodstream. And when we see things like chronic bronchitis, when we see a history of recurrent pneumonia, or if it's just somebody who is the first person to get sick when cold and flu season comes around, they get sick multiple times, or they stay sick for very long periods of time and it's very difficult to recover, chances are that person has some kind of a leaky lung. Now, what are the impacts? Well, of course, localized inflammation. We see that whether it's with leaky gut or with leaky brain or with leaky lung, we see inflammation actually attached to the tissue that's involved in that barrier system. So it's kind of a localized inflammatory response. But just like with the inflammation spillover that happens with leaky gut, as well as with leaky brain, if the primary insult is an injury to the brain and then brain inflammation that moves outward into the body, we can see the same thing with the inflammatory event or the inflammatory cascade that comes from having a chronic lung issue, breakdown of the lung barrier, where the inflammatory cascade seeps out of the local lung environment and then starts to drive systemic inflammation. And we see this a lot of times where people who have not just the history of the chronic illness like we just talked about, the upper respiratory stuff, but sometimes we'll do deep nasal swabs, not looking for COVID. And at this point, probably everyone's been tested for COVID maybe once or a few times. And so we're starting to become familiar, but we've been doing these deep nasal swabs to look for other types of infections for a very long time. And so somebody might not necessarily have like the classic, I've got COPD or I've got chronic bronchitis. Maybe they just have chronic sinus issues. Or maybe they don't have any sinus pain or they don't have a runny nose, but they have a deep-seated infection and an inflammatory response that breaks down that barrier system. And a lot of times they experience these very bizarre head, face, and neck symptoms that can't be pinned on something else. And so if I have a client who contacts me and wants to work together, and they start talking about having these weird sensations in and around their head, face, and neck, and nobody has been able to figure it out, whether or not they have a history of sinus infections or not, we might want to stick something up there and twirl it around, pull it out and send it off to a lab just to see if there's something growing in there that's causing this breakdown in the barrier system, which then leads again to not just local inflammation up in the sinuses, but can affect the entire respiratory tree and then spill out and cause inflammation into the rest of the body. So one of the key things about having or looking for or thinking about leaky lung is that unlike the valid scientific tests that we have for a leaky gut or a leaky brain, we don't have the same thing for the leaky lung. And so we rely on clinical presentation as well as, to be honest, educated guessing. And that's okay sometimes. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.